My name is Marcia Eli, and on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and the Center for Brooklyn History, it's my joy and privilege to welcome you. Tonight, we are honored to host three experts on a topic that I suspect keeps many of us up at night: the state of our democracy. As we count down to November's election, the illiberal impulses, I'll go ahead and use the word, the fascist impulses of these last many years, beg questions about the future of our 250-year-old experiment in self-government. Is the march of authoritarian, I'm so upset by it, I can't even get the word out. Is that march around the world making its way here? So tonight we'll explore the line between illiberalism and fascism as it informs the moment we live in, with Pulitzer-Prize winning historian Steven Hahn, whose new book, Illiberal America, looks at this illiberal strain of political thought and how it has been woven within our democratic society from the start, and historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a leading expert on authoritarianism, democracy protection, and propaganda, whose latest book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, serves, in a sense, as a wake-up call to America. Both Steve and Ruth's books, Illiberal America and Strongmen, are available at the CBH shop over there, and I know they'll be very delighted to sign after the conversation. I am deeply honored that Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, will moderate tonight's conversation. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to revitalize the nation's systems of democracy and justice. A leading expert on democracy, Michael was director of speechwriting for President Bill Clinton from 1995 to 1999, and is the author of The Second Amendment, a biography, and The Fight to Vote. So, without any further ado, please help me welcome Steve, Ruth, and Michael to the stage.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Marcia Eli, a great friend, and what an incredible institution this is, so vital to the intellectual life of Brooklyn and to the city and now to the whole world through the streaming events and other things. I am Michael Waldman. I am a proud resident of Brooklyn, and we are so thrilled to welcome two visitors to the borough. From NYU. As Marcia said, this is, as we all know, an extraordinary moment in the life of our country and in the path of the democracy we hope to have and the ideals we hope to uphold. That is what we at the Brennan Center work on every day. We regard ourselves as being in the middle of a great fight for the future of American democracy. The stakes really are that high. And we know that this is a critically important time and a critically important year in that fight. And so it's extraordinarily necessary for us to understand what brought us here, where we are going, what the lessons of history are in this country and around the world. If we want to understand the challenges we face, we have to go deep and face difficult truths about our country, about the nature of power and authority, and about what we all can do to set ourselves on a better course. We know that on January 6th, 2021, when we saw that mob of people storm the seat of government, storm the United States Capitol, egged on by a defeated president, it was emotionally wrenching for so many. For so many of us, we felt and we said, this is not America, this is not who we are. But we have really got to ask ourselves to what extent that is actually true now, in the past, and going forward. And we're really, really lucky to have two of the nation's leading scholars on these issues in the United States and comparatively to help be our guides. I will introduce them a bit more than Marcia was able to. First of all, Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a historian who writes about authoritarianism and democracy protection and propaganda. She is a professor of history and Italian studies at NYU. She's the recipient of Guggenheim and other fellowships, and is a frequent commentator, as you probably know, on MSNBC, on CNN, and many other venues. She publishes Lucid, a tremendous Substack newsletter. I want to ask about the name of it, but that'll be a different conversation, about threats to democracy. And her most recent book is Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, which looks at how illiberal leaders use propaganda and corruption and violence and machismo, and how they can be defeated. And to her left is Steven Hahn. He is a Pulitzer-Prize winning historian who studies American political and social movements. He also teaches at NYU. His acclaimed works include A Nation Under Our Feet and A Nation Without Borders, and the new book, Illiberal America, which tells a challenging and surprising, in some ways, alternative story from the comfortable version of our nation that we tell ourselves about all the time. And first of all, I want to thank you both for being here and being part of this conversation. I want to start by asking you, as historians, as scholars, how you see this moment, and in particular, why your most recent writing, why you undertook your most recent writing. And I will actually start with Steve and your recent book. Why did you write this book now?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Marcia, and to the center, and thank you all for coming out tonight. In some ways, I've been writing about illiberalism practically for my entire life as a historian, though principally from the perspective of those who were on the receiving end of what illiberalism dealt out. I've mostly studied humble white folk and black folk and people of color, but I was interested in writing this, not surprisingly, beginning with the Trump campaign in 2016, but not so much because of what Trump was doing, but in fact, because of the way in which what he was doing was received by journalists and other observers, and who were continually talking about how he was violating liberal democratic norms. And as someone who was pretty familiar with American political history, I wasn't clear what those norms were. And in fact, for people who were, look back even for a quarter century, what do we see? David Duke ran for governor and senator in Louisiana and won 60% of the white vote. Pat Buchanan talked about a culture war at the Republican National Convention. Between him and Newt Gingrich, they were already moving the Republican Party in a very right-wing trajectory. The Supreme Court in 2000 intervened in a presidential election. The court then, of course, in Citizens United, opened the spigot of big money, undermined the Voting Rights Act. Individual states were moving in that direction all along. And I understood why there was some comfort in feeling that this was an unusual moment, that in fact the political soil was fertile and Donald Trump was kind of a noxious weed who could be pulled out and everything would be okay. But I knew this wasn't the case, and so I decided to make more of a deep dive, and in part to decenter liberalism over the course of American history. Not to say it wasn't important, but in fact to suggest it was one of numbers of political currents that flowed both across the Atlantic and across the country. And I was particularly interested in what I've called illiberalism, obviously learning a lot from a literature that is of relatively recent vintage, but nonetheless, I thought had the possibility of encompassing a variety of social and political forms that actually predate liberalism itself and move across the decades of our history. What I was interested in doing was, in fact, picking out moments in the past, not where the most egregious forms of illiberalism were to be found, but actually moments that we associate more clearly with the development of liberalism and to interrogate them. So just to briefly finish, the book starts with a chapter on what I call the invention of the liberal tradition, because in point of fact, interpreters of American history never talked about this really until the period of the Cold War. And then for all sorts of reasons, some of which you could understand, the idea of American exceptionalism became extremely important. The idea of a consensus view of American history was extremely important. And then in the book, I go back to the 17th century and in many pages, move up to the near present. And I can talk more about that, including what I think about illiberalism, and I think it will overlap with much of what Ruth is going to talk about.
And just to, the book is really a tremendous reminder that so much of our history has been a brawl, a very political, a very hotly contested brawl between different competing visions of the country from the beginning. Could you just quickly define what you mean by liberalism? Because,
Okay,
of course, it has
fair
a specific
enough.
political meaning,
Yes.
but you mean something a bit broader than that.
Right, I do. I mean, when I writing this book, both in terms of liberalism and illiberalism, I think about it chiefly in political terms. But basically what I'm talking about is a sort of set of ideas and relationships, ideological orientations that, first of all, are organized around inequality, not equality, that are embrace ideas about what you might call ascriptive or assigned hierarchies organized around race or gender or nationality, talking about the importance of cultural and religious homogeneity, of defining rights in limited and what you might call particularist rather than broad and universal ways. The idea of defining internal as well as external enemies and resorting either to exclusion or expulsion as a way of dealing with political unrest. And more generally, I would say the idea of the will of the community over the rule of law. And of course, community is defined in many different ways. And part of what I'm interested in doing in the book is not telling a continuity story, but in fact talking about the ways in which illiberalism, illiberal ideas, relationships, political conflicts change over time. They come from the bottom up and from the top down. When they do so simultaneously, you're in for big trouble. But they do work in all these different ways. So I hope this is a starter.
And so, Ruth, you in your work, your comparative work, have pulled the lens back beyond our borders. I was really struck in the beginning of your book, Strongmen. There's a cast of characters, and it begins with Idi Amin and ends with Donald Trump. And I don't know if it was alphabetical or I couldn't parse out precisely what the method was of ordering. But what does that look at the wider world have to tell us, and why have you done this work?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming out. And some of my students are here, so hello. So I've been studying fascism for many years and didn't study much American history. I'm also first generation, so I just wasn't that familiar with the history of my own country. And so I was chugging along doing my work on fascism and propaganda, and I had had the experience, besides studying fascism as what I thought was a dead movement, of living in Italy when Silvio Berlusconi came to power. And this was very formative for me because he was the first, he's considered, a clown. He's passed away now. But people didn't take him seriously, but he was the first person to bring neo-fascists into the government. He normalized the extreme right. And a lot of the stuff he was doing, and so I was living in Rome, and I saw people who, they used to say, oh, your Italian's so good, you're studying fascism, and then they would be silent about it. After Berlusconi came in and normalized the far right, people would say to me, oh, Mussolini, he did so many good things for the country. The only people who paid a price were subversives and Jews. And it was all said out loud. So I'd had that experience about how memory could shift. And so I started thinking about our times, thinking about like far right, memory politics in different European countries. So that's going on. And then Donald Trump comes down the escalator, and there he is. And I was already writing for CNN, so I started writing about Steve Bannon in the fall and I basically been able to turn the lens of what then became a study of global mostly right-wing autocracy, but not exclusively, onto America to see what was happening that was supporting Donald Trump and what the patterns are. The book is about finding patterns. And so, for example, when do authoritarians appeal? Well, it turns out in 2016, we were like perfectly suited because they appeal when many people think that there's been way too much social progress, there's been too much gender emancipation, too much racial equity, and it's time for a backlash, or as I'm also calling it, a counter-revolution. And so these charismatic demagogues come on the scene, and there's certain qualities that they have that the outcomes are different. It's not going to be like the Hitler one-party state. But these people have similar personalities. They're incredibly good at communicating. They use the latest technologies and the latest media beautifully. Mussolini had newsreels, and Modi used holograms, and Trump had Twitter. So they bond with people, and people believe them because they believe in them. So there are these... so the book is about the meeting of these charismatic demagogues with society at certain times. And I saw that we were going through the same thing, the normalization of extremism, the attacks on the press, on the judiciary. And so that's what made me want to write the book as a warning by an American scholar of autocracy to my own country. Basically, yes, it can happen here. It always looks different, and so we maybe don't see it coming, but no one has ever seen it coming, actually. Everybody's been surprised, and we can talk more about that. So that's why I wrote the book, as a warning, and also as a reminder that history matters. Because everywhere you have authoritarianism, you have the revision of history, the erasure of history. And we're seeing this in the States, in our country. And so it was also a kind of vindication of history. We need to know this stuff. We need to know the past, and we need to know how it's repeating or not repeating in the present.
So you talk about authoritarianism and even fascism. And you're both in your work and just now. And in the U.S. context, just as there was a period when New Deal liberalism was discredited by being labeled as communist, there was a notion that, well, if you were losing an argument in the U.S., you say the other side is Hitler. But it seems certainly more relevant today and more appropriate today to talk about authoritarianism and fascism. Are those relevant terms in the American context? Or not? In what way is that rhetorically appropriate?
I think it's appropriate because, unfortunately, the GOP has become, under Trump's lead, an autocratic entity. And a lot of the things that are going on, the dynamics of the party and the leader, everything from things that some of us might want to laugh at, like Trump is ritually humiliating GOP, officials, the recourse to a coup attempt. That, January 6th, I wrote a piece for CNN on January 6th calling it a coup attempt. And I stand by that still. And when you are there, we're in the middle of an authoritarian, massive attempt to delegitimize all of our institutions. Congress, the courts, the press, to have people lose faith in them. And so many of the things going on and the dynamics of the party and the leader now having kind of the inner sanctum that Trump had, putting his family there. Now Lara Trump's going to hollow out the RNC and make it into a cash cow for Trump. All of these things that go on, guess what? They go on in autocracies. That's the playbook. Now, many of them, things like, kind of playing with elections have gone on here, and this is the American history. So I have actually learned a lot about American history since I have been writing on these subjects. But I do believe that it's that talking about what's going on now through the lens of dynamics of authoritarianism, the leader cult of Trump, is extremely useful. And so the public work I've done has been trying to educate journalists and the public to understand these dynamics. And it's a bit of a leap. We don't want to see that here. We can't have that here. We don't have a leader cult, right? But indeed, I believe we do.
Well, and two of the aspects of that are particularly chilling to political insiders is the Republican platform at their 2000 convention. It was virtual, but the platform, they didn't do a platform. They just basically said, whatever Trump says, we agree. And now his daughter-in-law is co-chair of the RNC, and they're shaking it up, and that actually happens, and that's not itself that unusual. But apparently in the job interviews for people, whether they're going to keep their job, the key threshold question is, did Joe Biden steal the election from Donald Trump? That is the test in the job interview. And so it is both being an election denier or willing to say you're an election denier as the ticket for even keeping your job. I want to go to the question, because we grapple with this all the time. So much of the work we did over the years has been around those imbalances in American democracy that are rooted in race and in class and in the baked-in inequalities in our system. And I hate to put it that those are the good old days, but sometimes we look at what's going on and we say, well, this is the latest chapter of a long story. And other times, in particular around election denial and the attempts to undermine the machinery of elections, to us it feels very different and very new and authoritarian. And I'm wondering, I really want to talk about what's the American context.
Right.
You see
One of the things I think is really important is to shift our focus a little bit away from the national level and look at the state and local levels. There's no question that a loyalty cult around Trump is developing, but we see in recent years what state legislatures have been in the process of doing, and it's an example, actually, of all sorts of authoritarian politics over the course of our history that have unfolded on the local level and is not readily apparent to most of us. Some of the worst of it has happened in the South, not only under slavery, but in the period after slavery. One political scientist has talked about authoritarian enclaves and the way in which the fight against desegregation was in part a way of empowering those enclaves. George Wallace, who talked endlessly about state rights, was in the process of building an incredibly authoritarian regime in Alabama that was built around loyalty to him. I would also, so I think this is really, really important. You know, if you want to think about coups, overthrowing duly elected governments, you know, look there. And it happens again and again and again. I mean, there are especially egregious examples happening during Reconstruction. I finished my book with an example of a biracial coalition that ruled a county in East Texas for 2 decades. Under various names of independence, of greenback labor, and the populist. And finally, in 1900, the local elite formed the White Man's Union and decided how they would end this. They gunned down the entire leadership, beginning with the black leaders. So these kind of things are happening all the time. I want to mention something about fascism. You know, one of the things I don't think we're sufficiently aware of, and this is not to draw a direct line, because I think, if anything, Ruth has been very, very good at being historically specific. But in the 1920s, you know, through the repression of the left, through the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, which was clearly the largest social and political movement of the 1920s, through the imposition of the Immigration Act of 1924, prohibition. You know, the Klan didn't have its own party, but it didn't need its own party because they took over governments at the local, state, all the way up, you know, touched the Supreme Court. So in some ways, and they, you know, they look to Mussolini as an example of the way forward, not only the Klan, but widely in American political life. The Klan was likened to the black shirts, as was the American Legion. This is really a topic for study that has not been taken up, and the role that they played as an anti-radical and anti-labor organization in the 1920s. So it raises a lot of interesting questions about what happened in the 1930s and why the United States didn't veer in the same direction as other societies in Europe and to some extent in Latin America.
Yeah, you know, Mussolini, he was an international icon. And remember, he got into power in 1922, and Hitler wasn't there for 10 years. In fact, Hitler worshipped Mussolini because Mussolini started fascism in 1919, and 3 years later, he was in office. And 3 years after that, he was a dictator. So Hitler was obsessed with Mussolini, and he was always trying to get an autographed picture from from Mussolini, and he was writing him like every day. And Mussolini was like, "Who's this loser who can't?" You know, Hitler was not doing well, and so it was Mussolini who was the anti-communist icon, and he had so many backers in the financial establishment, House of Morgan, you know, precursor of J.P. Morgan. And William Randolph Hearst gave Mussolini a syndicated column, which he had for 7 years, that reached 1,000 newspapers. So Mussolini himself, who was a journalist by training, so there's all this history of dictator worship, right-wing dictator worship, in the United States well before our days. And I think that's also something. I have a little of it in Strongmen. And of course, then going into the Cold War and the US-backed military dictatorships. But Mussolini was this kinetic, dynamic, like icon, and everybody loved him in the States, except for people who really didn't love him because they'd been persecuted by him and had to leave, right?
Well, in a way, of course, they didn't know what we now know. They didn't know what the end point of this was. One for New Yorkers, one thing that, to the point of the normalization of fascism and the glamour of fascism, when they built Rockefeller Center, they had the different buildings because it was a really tough time for real estate. So as you know, there's the English building, and it's got the English symbols on it, and there's the French building, and they call the area in between the channel. Across the street was Casa Italia, which was covered with fasces.
Yeah.
Because that was the logo of that building. And as my understanding, it was covered over on December 8th, 1941. And now if you look, they have grapes and like, fig trees or something like that.
And now we have, as the Prime Minister of Italy, a hardcore neo-fascist who was a militant her whole life. Her views on, the Great Replacement theory are to the right of Tucker Carlson, and she masquerades as a conservative, but she's formed by Mussolini like 100%, and now she's the head of Italy. So what we do with the memory of these people and the way and writing history as resistance to its revision to whitewash it, because there's plenty of PR firms and other people who help autocrats today to whitewash their crimes. And so I think that our books are, in different ways, they're both trying to kind of open people's eyes to this history that can't be denied.
One of the through lines at the turn of the 20th century linking the United States and not only fascism in Italy, but in emerging fascism in Germany was eugenics. Now, eugenics really appealed to political figures across the spectrum of progressivism. They had this idea about the importance of social engineering as a project. Joseph Mengele got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1920s to do his work, and the correspondence between eugenists on both sides continued well into the 1930s, and those who were interested in eugenic work in the United States were thrilled to see that they had colleagues in Germany at the time. So, it's frightening.
Well, one of the questions about right now is how much of what's going on in Europe and in other countries around the world, and here, how much commonality and communications are there among autocratic forces? For a long time, when people looked at Putin, for example, they said, oh, he's just stirring the pot. Everywhere he can, he makes trouble, he's stirring the pot. He seems, however, invariably to be helping ethno-nationalist right-wing forces wherever he can. It doesn't seem to be the case anyway that he is merely being opportunistic. David Remnick of The New Yorker, that first election night in 2016, it was quite an amazing piece of instant analysis. He said that we were in a time of counter-revolution and backlash, and that in the U.S. there had been a social revolution in the 50s and 60s, and in Europe there had been a democratic revolution with the expansion of democracy, especially at the end of the Cold War. And so in the U.S., the counter-revolution was more around social issues and not so much of a challenge to democracy. One could argue maybe there's been a convergence, but how much is this a global ideological battle, or are we just imposing, if I think that's the case, am I just imposing kind of Cold War templates on what's going on? Like, why is it happening all over the place all at once?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number. First of all, it's not simply to flatten out, the differences between what's going on the western side of the Atlantic and what's going on elsewhere. Obviously, the United States has a complicated and different trajectory in its history, certainly around race, about a history of enslavement within its borders, as opposed to European powers where they were able to export it to their colonies and really didn't have to deal with the issue about race until the empire struck back and, migrations, picked up. Clearly, one of the, I think, connecting threads has to do with the enormous economic changes that have taken place in the last few decades that have had impacts all over the place. Deindustrialization, the calling into question of social democratic regimes, the emergence of neoliberal ideas as an alternative to modern liberalism, the squeezing of the working class, and the attacks that are true all over the place on unions. Certainly one of the things that has happened in the United States since the 1970s is that labor has come under pretty concerted attacks, and until recently, which is one of the most interesting developments of this particular period, which is the reigniting of organized labor, that this has also left working people, whatever their particular racial and ethnic background, especially vulnerable. So I do think that there's sort of a kind of links of commonality, but at the same time that the sort of timing of this and the particularities are important to recognize.
So I'll say one depressing thing and one optimistic thing. In my first book, which was called Fascist Modernities, it was about Italy and also Italian fascism being kind of part of these networks of what was called the Fascist International. Now, you could see that there's a new, like Fascist International 2.0 going on today. There are a lot of, Viktor Orban is a model for this nefarious Project 2025, which has a very neutral name, but is actually Project Make America Autocratic. It's very scary.
And what, for those who don't know, what is Project 2025? It's the plan put together by the Heritage Foundation, which was the think tank that put together the plan for Ronald Reagan in 1980. And this is now for a potential second term for Trump or any other authoritarian president who might get sworn in.
Yeah, and one of the main things is that they say there's, quote, an existential need for an aggressive use of the vast powers of the executive branch. But their muse is Viktor Orban. And they love him because he's been able to have this kind of electoral autocracy, which is a name for when you keep elections going, also in Turkey with Erdogan, but you have domesticated the media, you've you've fired all the non-compliant judges, you've cleansed the electoral system so that the results are weighted to get what you need out of them so you could stay in power, and other reasons. Also, he gets away with corruption. So, but there are a lot of, like Meloni in Italy she considers the GOP to be a kindred spirit. So when I say that the GOP is like an autocratic entity now, it's not just because of how it behaves at home, like backing January 6th and all of its sycophantism to Trump. It's also how it behaves with foreign. It's inserted into foreign networks that are growing more powerful. So that's the part that's disturbing. However, Steve mentioned the revival of labor. I also believe that, we don't hear about it, and I really wish we would, this would be centered in the press. We're in the middle of a renaissance of nonviolent mass protest. All over the world, there are countries where they're either having the biggest protests they've ever had, like in Israel before October 7th, or the biggest they've had in decades, in Belarus, in Poland, where they just turned back the far right, Chile, 2019. I could name you 10, 15 examples. So there's something happening. There's now a new opposition movement that's starting in Hungary. There's something happening where, especially younger people, they know that strongmen are not just ruining democracy, they are an existential threat to humanity because they are plunderers, they are warmongers. And so there are international networks shaping up around what I would call an anti-authoritarian order. And it's hard to see right now when we see, everything going on with autocrats waging wars. But so this is not going to happen tomorrow. But I truly believe, and I do have a pretty good track record at being right, usually about depressing things. I'm usually right about depressing things. But I truly believe that this is going to happen. So that's my optimistic read for tonight.
So let me put out whoops. I'm no good with these microphones. and in any venue. I never get it right. Let me put out at least an argument that there is something that has been different about the United States that has been a source of progress and strength for a rights-based society and liberalism in the way that you're describing, which is we have the racial issue, but we also have immigration from all over the world as a central narrative for so many people in the country. We were founded hypocritically, but with documents and arguments that were, for the time, radically democratic and radically egalitarian, and which have been the source of strength for the abolitionists, for Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, for every progressive and positive movement for social change up to the civil rights movement and beyond. And the civic religion in the United States, the civic religion.
Now you turned it off.
Now I turned it off. No? Is that better? Yeah, it is better. It's just me. No, I'm the one that's faulty. I know that. Okay. The civic religion has been a powerful and meaningful source of strength, and it isn't the case that it's the only tradition that Lewis Hart's from the 1950s notwithstanding, but it's sometimes easy to write it out of the history altogether. And so when we do our work, we have the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence on the walls of the Brennan Center, not because we think they are describing reality, but because that's the only path we have. Why is that wrong, or what is that?
Well, I don't think it's wrong. I don't think there's any question that there have been really powerful moments. I wouldn't necessarily only call them liberal. There are broadly democratic that have distinguished the United States, especially in the eyes of people who are outside the United States. And I might add that over the course of American history, I don't think that there are any groups of people who are more consistently supportive of democracy and rights in the most expansive ways than those people who have been denied them. And that has everything to do with the dynamic of American history. But I would say that it's important for us to recognize important countercurrents. So, for example, one of the most powerful aspects of American political culture from the beginning well into the 20th century is anti-Catholicism. During the 1830s, the age of Jacksonian democracy was also an age of expulsions, not only of Native people, who are obviously most prominently and most viciously expelled, but of Black people, of Mormons, of Catholics, of dissidents. So there's this intertwining of democracy and exclusion simultaneously. I think that, think about, nativism in the 1840s and 1850s, which was not oriented toward excluding immigrants, but disempowering them politically. The Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, eventually the 1924 immigration law that established quotas and that was on the books and doomed Jewish refugees from Europe, precisely because they were exactly the people who were being targeted, both because of where they came from and, of course, their political dispositions. People on the right these days, if they are asked to mark what are the most important turning points in American history, one is the 14th Amendment, which they think was a disaster, and the other is the 1965 immigration law that opened borders that had been closed to people from Africa, to people from Latin America, to people, from Asia. What I would simply say is that the aspirations that the Declaration and the powerful, I would say, liberal and radical currents in American history have demonstrated is that without continuous political struggle, they fall into the holes. In the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville was a visitor to the United States, and as many of you know, he wrote the iconic Democracy in America, where he, for the most part, was celebrating a kind of robust democracy on the ground. But toward the end, he warned his readers that he never was in a country that had less freedom of discussion and that was more likely to see a republic descend into a despotism than he saw in the United States, for many of the same reasons that we worry about today. So on the one hand, I think it would be a terrible mistake to write or think about a history of the United States without those aspirations, because they are, the most important things that we have to hold, and, are rightly proud of those who inscribe them, in our documents and in our history. But the people who really, saw them in their fullest were the people who were not part of this at the beginning.
Ruth, how important, as you look at our situation, in a sense, almost from a outside in terms of your scholarship, how important are institutions? One of the things that has happened is at the beginning of Trump's term, at the beginning of Trump's term, people talked about, he's violating the norms and the unwritten rules. And by now, some of the same scholars are saying, hey, the Electoral College seems to be rather unequal in its design, or the U.S. Senate, which has 2 senators per state, irrespective of what the population is very unequal, and is getting more so as the gap between the smallest state and the biggest states grow and grow. When they did the Senate, and it was the thing that almost blew up the Constitution, the Connecticut Compromise, you may remember from high school history, was the thing they did to get the Constitution written. That was about whether there would be popular representation in the Senate. And people like Madison and Hamilton were aghast. But at that time, the biggest state, Virginia, was only 7 times bigger than the smallest state. Now, California is dozens of times bigger than the smallest state. These things, the lifetime tenure for the Supreme Court, which is what I wrote a book about, the supermajority last year. How much is it the institutions? How important are they? And when you look at strongmen and what has constrained them and what they've needed to overcome, how important were those institutions? You get a mic.
So the one definition of authoritarianism is it's a system where you arrange government so that you can get away with crimes. And this is what I think about. And the people who often are killed by authoritarians, Navalny, Nemtsov, his mentor, are people who go after corruption. And so authoritarianism is, again, it's rearranging government. So authoritarians don't care at all about governing. They only care about arranging institutions and structures of government so that they can profit from them and they can feel safe. So regular politicians, if you're under investigation, you don't want to run for office. Like journalists will start probing, but if you're an authoritarian, you have to run for office because you got to get into power or get back, and then you can shut down the source of your anxiety. You arrange government so that you can be untouchable by the law, and your cronies too. That's also why you have these, what I call inner sanctums. You put your family there. You've got your cronies. So it's not just Trump who's doing this. Netanyahu, Putin, he was under investigation the first time he ran. And Berlusconi was under investigation every time he ran, 3 times, right? And by the way, Berlusconi had, when he left finally, he had, Trump has how many indictments? 4?
Well, it was 91.
Oh,
it was
counts.
91. Now it's down to only 87.
The counts or indictments?
4 trials, 87 counts.
Yeah.
0 trials underway yet, at least till next Monday.
So, and when he left office, Berlusconi had 14 corruption trials, major corruption trials, and 24 indictments, and he never went to jail. So but all of them, because they are corrupt and because the purpose of their political careers is to avoid being accountable, they all go after the same people. Investigative journalists or journalists in general, prosecutors, judges, and they try and delegitimize. They try and turn the public against all of these institutions. So that's one thing they do, and they all do it. The other is that they're very good at they're very creative. They don't care about governing, but they do care about finding loopholes and, using office in ways that hasn't been used before. And so the democratic systems are not ready. They're not built for strongmen. And strongmen know this. And so, for example, I look at the Electoral College. So I'm sitting here as the scholar of autocracy with a jaundiced eye, and I'm like looking at the American system, which again I am not an expert in. And to me, the Electoral College, many people are upset about it because it seems elitist. I'm like, anytime you give so few people in our giant country all of that power, those people are going to be threatened by autocrats. They're going to have, they're going to be really threatened. That's how I look at things. Another thing that doesn't seem very, and by the way, this is called in some countries coup-proofing. You look over after you've had coups, because some countries like Turkey, they have a lot of coups. You look over your system and you see how you can coup-proof it. So one thing that doesn't seem very good to me is that, and is not the case in other countries, after somebody is elected, there's a really long time before they actually take office. And a lot of bad things can happen, as we saw. Those months give somebody who's a bad actor, like Donald Trump, enough time to do all kinds of things and plan a coup. So those are some of the reasons that I think one of the things that's great about Steve's book and goes so well with my work is that we need to look critically as though we have to autocrat-proof our systems, our institutions, but also ourselves in a way, because we're still as a country very attached to this kind of concept of power that's like, the movie star, like Trump, the glamorous man. And we need to kind of have a different decolonized or just a very different conception of what are our values and who we want to embody those values if we're going to, defeat autocracy and keep democracy more robust.
The only thing I would add is that, sometimes there's this sense that we do have these institutional so-called guardrails against attacks on liberal democracy and other values we seem to hold dear. Obviously, the Electoral College and the Center are two examples. We have to remind ourselves that the Constitution was written in the aftermath of a tumultuous decade. We know best Shays' Rebellion, but there was a great deal of unrest pushing in democratic direction, so that the Constitution itself was in part an attempt to put the brakes. And so there's a variety of ways. If you want to read about it, read the Anti-Federalists who, came pretty close to preventing the ratification of the Constitution. We also need to recognize that, we focus now, for example, on the Supreme Court because it seems so right-wing and so much out of joint. But in fact, over the course of U.S. history, there's probably only a 2-decade period, say from the mid-1950s into the early 1970s, when the court wasn't an extremely conservative, if not a reactionary institution. Think about the Dred Scott case. Think about Plessy v. Ferguson. Think about Lochner. All of this, and the once you go below the Supreme Court, the role that sort of not only federal courts but other courts played in undermining labor unrest and other forms of popular radicalism and popular initiatives. So But at the same time, we have the Reconstruction Amendments that were made possible by a revolution. 13th Amendment abolishing slavery without compensation to slaveholders. The 14th Amendment, which we've been hearing a lot about, that established birthright citizenship and is clearly a target of the right. The 15th Amendment, a weak one, but nonetheless suggests that the vote couldn't be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of service. These would not have been possible. There would be no amendments like this had there not been a civil war and had it not ended up as decisively as it did. Anything short of that, forget it. So slavery might have ended, but it would have been like the states of the Northeast and the Middle Atlantic, gradual emancipation stretching well into the 20th century, no birthright citizenship at all, and so on. So it goes in a lot of interesting ways.
Well, and democracy flourished in the South during Reconstruction because the United States Army with guns enforced it. And when the Army withdrew after 1876 was when, not as fast as we think, but when the withdrawal of those rights began. The other thing about the Supreme Court and the federal courts and their long status as a reactionary institution in our society, it was always the subject of massive political controversy. The 1912 presidential election, Teddy Roosevelt, when he ran as a third-party Bull Moose candidate, one of his major issues was taking on the Supreme Court for the Lochner decision, for its reactionary rulings trying to stop government from regulating, from protecting workers, protecting markets, and that sort of thing. So when you feel like yelling at the Supreme Court right now, that's not a violation of a norm. That's not transgressive. That's actually how it's been throughout all of the country's history.